The mission briefing was brief and straight to the point. It always was, especially with an operation like this. The world they were about to enter was alien, both in environment and politics. But for Major Thomas Knight, it was just another assignment to get in, get out, and save a life. He stood in front of the table, hands clasped behind his back, listening as the holographic display of the alien planet flickered before him. It was beautiful, a striking combination of vast oceans and towering mountain ranges. But beauty was deceptive. The planet was in turmoil. Political strife had been escalating for years, and now it had boiled over. The princess of the planet, Alara, had been abducted by one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy, a war-hungry race known as the Dracari. The princess was no mere symbol. She was the heart of peace between rival factions on the planet. Without her, war was all but inevitable. Behind him, the rest of the team stood silent, each lost in their own thoughts. They were the best humanity had to offer. Engineers, scientists, diplomats, soldiers. All highly trained, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. But none of them had any idea just how strange this mission was going to get. Thomas turned to face them. "Here's the situation," he began. "We're dealing with a culture we don't fully understand. The Dracari don't negotiate, and they'll hold the princess for leverage. We need to get her out fast. But here's the kicker." He paused for effect. "The tradition of her people dictates that anyone who rescues the princess marries her." There was a moment of stunned silence. The team exchanged confused glances. "I don't get it," Lieutenant Sarah Delgado said, frowning. "Why would a race that powerful have such a primitive custom?" Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's not primitive. It's part of their culture. The Dracari believe that anyone capable of rescuing their princess, someone who can navigate their complex political system, proves they are worthy of an alliance, sealed by marriage." "Are we talking about an actual wedding?" Sergeant Harris asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "But it's not about love. It's about power and diplomacy. For them, it's an agreement that binds two factions together. The human race would gain influence over this planet and others." Sarah shook her head, the disbelief still evident in her eyes. "That's not how we do things." "I know," Thomas said. "But that's what we're up against. Whether we like it or not, we're playing by their rules once we land." The team fell into an uneasy silence. They had trained for this mission for months, but nothing had prepared them for this kind of political mess. But one thing was certain. They weren't backing down. Not now, not after everything they had sacrificed. The briefing continued, outlining the terrain, the Dracari defenses, and their resistance. It was all standard procedure, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than they realized. He had seen alien politics before, but nothing this strange, this fraught with tradition. By the time they finished, the team was on their way to the ship. The spacecraft was sleek and efficient, built for stealth and rapid insertion. The journey to the planet would take 2 days, plenty of time to prepare for the unknown. As the engines powered up and the ship began its ascent, Thomas felt a strange unease settle in his stomach. It wasn't just the mission or the threat of the Dracari. It was the thought of what they might face once they landed. Could they really uphold the terms of this strange tradition? Was there more at stake than they knew? When they arrived, the landscape was nothing like the peaceful beauty depicted in the holograms. The planet's surface was a war-torn wasteland. Faded, decaying structures stood in the midst of battlefields where the Dracari had fought off rival factions, their power only increasing with each conquest. The Dracari had developed a reputation for being ruthless and efficient, but their brutality was nothing compared to the complexity of their politics. The team disembarked in full tactical gear, moving swiftly and quietly through the alien terrain. Their mission was to locate and extract the princess, but already they were encountering resistance. It was clear the Dracari were monitoring every move they made. "Stay low, stay sharp," Thomas ordered, his voice cutting through the stillness. "We don't have a lot of time." Sarah, always quick to respond, led the team through a series of narrow alleyways. The air was thick with dust and the faint scent of burning fuel, evidence of the constant skirmishes between the various factions. The mission was risky, and Thomas knew that every step brought them closer to the heart of the Dracary's power. But he had never been one to back down from a challenge. His mission was simple: rescue the princess and bring her home. He would worry about the rest later. As the team approached the Dracary stronghold, they encountered the first real obstacle, a heavily fortified compound guarded by drones and elite soldiers. The Dracary were not known for their mercy, and it was clear they would do anything to keep the princess from escaping. "Here we go," Thomas muttered under his breath, signaling the team to take positions. They moved in sync, each person a cog in the well-oiled machine that had been honed through countless missions. But even with their training, there was no guarantee they could succeed. The odds were stacked against them. As they breached the outer defenses, they were met with a flurry of laser fire and explosions. The Dracary were ready for them. It was a trap. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the princess's holding cell. She was seated calmly on a raised platform, as though she had been waiting for them all along. Her features were striking, her alien beauty unmistakable. She was dressed in the royal garb of her people, a flowing gown adorned with intricate designs. Her eyes, though, were what drew Thomas's attention. They were filled with a deep, profound sadness. "You came," she said softly, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "I knew you would. But you must know what this means." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "We're taking you home. The Dracary will not harm you anymore." She smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You do not understand, human. Your people are brave, yes. But your rescue will come with a price. The tradition must be upheld." He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing: there was no turning back. The mission had changed. It was no longer about just saving a life. It was about what came next, what they would do with that life, and how the universe would view the union of two very different cultures. "Let's get you out of here," Thomas said, his voice firm. The princess stood, her expression unreadable. "You will have to accept the tradition. It is the only way." This section establishes the tension and stakes of the mission, introducing the central conflict regarding the princess's unusual cultural tradition. It focuses on the human perspective, as Major Thomas Knight and his team navigate the complexities of rescuing an alien princess while coming to terms with a deeply ingrained custom that might alter the course of their future. Action point: the weight of what had transpired settled heavily on Major Thomas Knight's shoulders. The mission had changed from a straightforward rescue to a delicate political maneuver, and the consequences of their actions were already spiraling out of control. They hadn't even left the palace before he started receiving messages from his superiors, demanding updates. They had known what they were getting into, but nothing had prepared them for the complexity of the Dracary culture or the implications of the princess's marriage tradition. The path to the extraction point was fraught with danger. The Dracary forces had been alerted to the breach in their defenses, and it wasn't long before the team encountered their first wave of retaliation. A barrage of gunfire rang out, forcing them to take cover behind the remnants of a destroyed building. "Get moving," Thomas barked, his voice harsh as he led the charge forward. The team responded without hesitation, splitting off into their designated positions as the firefight intensified. Every movement had to be calculated. One mistake could mean the difference between success and failure. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece, a constant source of tension. "Sir, we've got more of them incoming. They're coordinating, anticipating our movements." Thomas gritted his teeth. They weren't just fighting to escape, they were fighting to stay alive. The Dracary were relentless, and the longer they stayed in the open, the more likely it was they'd be overwhelmed. "Keep pushing. We're almost there," he shouted back, even as his mind raced. They had to reach the extraction point before the Dracary could mobilize their full forces. If they didn't, the mission would end in disaster. As they closed in on their objective, Thomas's thoughts turned back to the princess. She had been calm, almost resigned, during the entire ordeal. Her acceptance of the tradition, of the marriage she was bound to, unsettled him. It wasn't the idea of marriage itself, It was the weight of the decision, the power dynamic behind it. Was she a willing participant in this custom, or was she merely a pawn in a much larger game? Major, you need to hear this, Sarah said, breaking through his reverie. The princess's people are mobilizing. She wasn't just a symbol. They believe her rescue is a sign of something greater. If we leave without fulfilling the tradition, we risk a full-scale war. Thomas's grip tightened on his weapon. That's a problem for later. Right now, our priority is getting off this damn planet. But the reality was Sarah was right. The princess's fate, and by extension, humanity's relationship with the Dracari, was now inextricably linked to this political quagmire. There was no easy way out. They had to adhere to the tradition or face the consequences. As they made their final push toward the extraction point, the chaos of the battlefield faded into the background. Thomas's mind raced through the possible outcomes. The Dracari weren't known for their diplomacy, and if they were forced to marry Alara, what would that mean for the team? For Earth? What would it mean for her? They reached the extraction point at the edge of the city, a dusty clearing marked by the arrival of their shuttle. The ship's engines hummed as it hovered in place, ready to take them back to the safety of orbit. The team moved with urgency, sprinting toward the shuttle. But as they approached, a Dracari warship appeared overhead, its dark silhouette blotting out the sky. The Dracari were closing in, and they wouldn't let them leave without facing the consequences of their actions. "Get to the shuttle now," Thomas ordered. The team poured into the ship, weapons raised, covering their six. The shuttle's engines roared to life, lifting off from the ground just as the Dracari warship fired on them. Explosions rocked the air as the shuttle narrowly avoided the deadly blasts. Inside, the team scrambled to secure the princess, who had remained eerily calm throughout the chaos. She stood near the door, watching Thomas with an unreadable expression. "Major, they're pursuing us," Sarah reported. "We won't outrun them unless we do something drastic." Thomas's mind raced. They needed to escape, but the Dracari's pursuit was relentless. They couldn't afford to return fire and risk escalating the situation further. There was a delicate balance to maintain, and if they were forced into a confrontation, there was no telling what the fallout would be. "Hold your fire," Thomas said through gritted teeth. "We can't afford to make things worse." The shuttle's autopilot was engaged, but the warship's advanced weapons were catching up. The Dracari weren't going to let them leave without exacting their price. The air was thick with tension as the team prepared for whatever came next. "Princess," Thomas said, turning to her, "what do we do now?" Alara's gaze was steady, and her voice was calm. "You must fulfill the tradition. Only then will you be free to leave." Thomas hesitated. "What are you asking?" "I'm asking you to marry me," she replied simply. The words struck him like a blow to the chest. In all the madness, he hadn't expected it to come to this. He had known this day might come, but facing the reality of it was something else entirely. "This isn't what I signed up for," Thomas said, his voice low. "We came here to rescue you. We didn't come here for an alliance." She shook her head, as if she had been expecting his resistance. "You are a symbol of hope for my people. If you do not fulfill the tradition, you will condemn both our worlds to war. There is no other way." Thomas stared at her, torn. His training told him to prioritize the mission, to do whatever was necessary to get the princess home. But this was beyond the scope of what he had anticipated. He wasn't prepared to marry an alien princess, not under these circumstances. Yet, the weight of the decision hung over him. A failure to comply with the Dracari custom would mean an end to peace, possibly even the destruction of a planet. As the shuttle ascended through the clouds and into the blackness of space, Thomas felt the magnitude of the situation. There was no escaping it now. They had been thrust into a role they hadn't chosen, and there was no going back. He had a responsibility now not just to the princess, but to humanity. If he refused, the consequences would be dire. The Dracari's warship pursued them relentlessly, but it was clear they weren't going to destroy them. They were testing them, pressuring them to comply. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a political trap. No matter what he did, the galaxy's balance was shifting. The princess had made her stance clear. The tradition must be fulfilled, or the universe would pay the price. They had survived the extraction, but the real mission had just begun. This section drives the urgency of the situation while emphasizing the heavy burden of the choices the team must make, particularly Thomas. The conflict is not just physical, but deeply political, as the team's very survival hinges on navigating complex cultural traditions and expectations. The shuttle's engines roared as they made their way toward the designated rendezvous point, cutting through the thick atmosphere of the planet. Thomas sat in the cockpit, his hands gripping the controls, eyes scanning the radar. The mission wasn't over yet. Even though they had the princess with them, the danger wasn't behind them. The Dracari warship still pursued, determined to enforce their customs and prevent them from escaping without fulfilling the marriage tradition. The princess sat quietly behind him, her gaze fixed on the stars outside. She had said little since the confrontation, her composed demeanor never faltering. It was as if she had already accepted what was to come. Thomas couldn't help but wonder if she was truly resigned to her fate, or if she was simply playing her part in this complex web of politics. His mind raced, unable to shake the weight of the situation. He wasn't just a soldier now, he was a pawn in a cosmic game. A marriage to an alien princess wasn't just about personal sacrifice. It was about politics, diplomacy, and the future of two civilizations. If he did what was expected, it would change everything. If he refused, it could ignite a war that could lead to the destruction of everything they had fought for. Major, the Dracari are closing in, Sarah's voice cut through the silence, breaking his train of thought. We won't outrun them at this rate. We don't have a choice, Thomas muttered, focusing on the controls. They couldn't afford to engage in combat. Their only hope was to get to the extraction point without triggering an all-out war. The Dracari ship followed closely behind, its massive silhouette dwarfing their shuttle. The enemy ship fired another round of warning shots, shaking the shuttle's frame with the impact. But they couldn't afford to return fire. Doing so would make the situation worse. We need to find a way to disable their weapons, Sarah continued, her voice calm but urgent. Otherwise, they're not going to let us get away. Thomas's brow furrowed. It was a risky maneuver. They had no time to plan, no way to guarantee success. But they had to try. We'll have to make it look like we're in trouble, he said. If we can create an opening, maybe we can get the drop on them. Sarah's voice was terse. Understood. It was a long shot, but it was the only option they had. With one quick maneuver, Thomas brought the shuttle into a sharp dive, simulating a malfunction. The Dracari ship followed, firing another volley, but Thomas kept the shuttle on course. They were close to the rendezvous point now, but he knew the Dracari wouldn't give up easily. The shuttle was small, fast, but it wouldn't be able to outrun the warship forever. Major, we have a problem, Sarah said again. They're locking onto us. They're preparing to fire again. Keep us steady, Thomas replied through gritted teeth. Just a little longer. The shuttle shook again as another round of shots hit their shields. He couldn't afford to take another hit. Not now. Not when they were so close. But as they neared the extraction point, the signal from their rescue ship came through. All units, stand by for immediate extraction. Do not engage the Dracari. Prepare for immediate pullout. Thomas's hand tightened on the throttle, pushing the shuttle forward with everything it had. Hold on, he ordered, steering the shuttle toward the awaiting rescue vessel. They were almost there. But then, a sudden blast rocked the shuttle from behind. The ship jolted violently, and alarms blared as the shield's power began to deplete. The Dracari weren't going to let them escape without making a statement. Brace for impact, Thomas yelled, throwing the shuttle into evasive maneuvers. The rescue ship had to wait until the Dracari were in position. It was a delicate game now. If they didn't act soon, the Dracari would force them to engage in a conflict they couldn't afford. The Dracari warship loomed even larger on the screen as the shuttle raced toward the extraction zone. Every second mattered. Every moment they stayed in range of the warship was another second they could be destroyed. But then the tide shifted. Major, the Dracari are pulling back, Sarah exclaimed. They've stopped firing. They're maintaining their distance. Thomas's mind raced. Had they finally realized the futility of pursuing them any further? Or were they simply waiting for a better opportunity to strike? There was no time to think. They had to move now, or the Drackery would force them into a situation with no way out. "Pull up to the rendezvous," he ordered sharply. The shuttle shot upward, making its final approach toward the extraction ship. The massive ship loomed ahead, its docking bay wide open, ready to take them in. They were close, so close, but the Drackery were still shadowing their movements. Thomas didn't know how much longer they could avoid detection. It was a race against time. Just as the shuttle was about to dock, the Drackery warship fired one last shot, the blast narrowly missing them. It was a warning, a message. But the shuttle was already inside the safety of the extraction vessel. The door slammed shut with a loud thud as they entered the ship, and the engines roared to life, blasting them away from the Drackery warship. Inside the extraction vessel, there was a brief moment of silence. Everyone was catching their breath. They had made it, but at what cost? Thomas turned to the princess, who was still sitting calmly in her seat. She hadn't flinched during the entire ordeal. It was as if she had expected it to happen. "We're safe for now," Thomas said, his voice hoarse. "But we're not out of the woods yet. The Drackery won't stop here. They'll keep pushing until we fulfill the tradition." The princess met his gaze, her eyes soft but firm. "I understand. But you still have a choice." A knot formed in Thomas's stomach. He didn't want to admit it, but the situation was growing increasingly complicated. The choices he made now would shape the fate of two civilizations. If he rejected the marriage, the Drackery would consider it an insult, and the conflict would only escalate. If he went through with it, it would create an alliance, but at what personal cost? "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't have much of a choice." The princess nodded, as if she had known what he would say. Sometimes, the fate of worlds rests on the choices of a single person. Thomas didn't respond. His mind was already whirling with the implications of what was to come. They had been thrust into something much larger than themselves. And now there was no going back. The journey home was long, filled with uncertainty. Thomas knew the peace that they had fought for could unravel in an instant, depending on how they navigated the next few weeks. But for now, they had made it. The Drackery were temporarily at bay, but the tension remained thick in the air. The political landscape was shifting, and Thomas was caught in the middle of it all. The silence on the ship was deafening. They had escaped, but the war was far from over. The marriage, the alliance, it was only the beginning. This section continues the focus on urgency and complexity. It builds tension and highlights the monumental decisions that must be made, keeping the action dynamic and direct while dealing with the political implications.